In the weeks following the deepening of the auroras and the widespread awakening of ancient memories, Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed began to notice a new phenomenon, unlike anything they had encountered before. At first, it was subtle, almost easy to dismiss curious distortions in photographs, odd sensations of weightlessness or heaviness, brief moments when sounds seemed to echo strangely, or when colors appeared too vivid or muted. But as they ventured deeper into the zones of strongest resonance, the anomalies became impossible to ignore. The fabric of reality itself seemed to ripple and flex, as if the world were no longer entirely solid, no longer entirely stable. Evelyn was the first to step into one of these areas, near the heart of a dense forest, where the trees formed spiraling patterns. Unlike any natural growth, the air shimmered around her like heat rising from asphalt. Yet the temperature was cool. A mist of pale silver hovered low to the ground, and as she moved forward, the light bent around her, warping her reflection into impossible angles. For a moment she saw herself stretched thin and woven into the branches, before snapping back with a disorienting jolt. Daniel, following close behind, noticed that the ground beneath them felt softer, as if they were walking on memory rather than earth. His instruments recorded wild fluctuations, electromagnetic surges, gravitational inconsistencies, and time distortions. So minute yet undeniable a leaf falling from a tree would slow to a crawl midair, suspended before completing its descent in a sudden lurch. Jonathan recorded the ambient sounds, finding layers of frequencies far below and above human hearing, some of which formed coherent melodies patterns not made by any known animal or machine. Samuel noted how shadows flickered against the trees, even when there was no clear source of movement. Vague figures half seen drifting at the edge of vision, vanishing. When looked at directly at first, they suspected a natural cause, some interplay of magnetic fields and atmospheric conditions amplified by the rising resonance. But it soon became clear that what they were encountering was not merely an amplification of known forces. It was the beginning of something new, or perhaps something very old. Returning, Evelyn began to map these anomalies, marking where the bending of light was most severe, where time lagged or accelerated, in patches where the mist thickened into translucent veils. She realized that the strongest distortions occurred precisely at the nodes where multiple streams of resonance intersected. It was as if the overlapping waves were not just enhancing life and memory, but stretching the very canvas of space. Daniel theorized that the resonance was reaching critical thresholds in these places, causing micro-fractures in space-time, allowing glimpses into other states of being, other layers of reality not entirely separate from their own. Jonathan felt that the music of the world was changing, that these zones were not random but part of a larger symphony, a complex shifting chord where certain notes caused the structure of reality to tremble. Samuel gathered accounts from local communities describing encounters with the phenomena, hunters who tracked animals only to find themselves walking through landscapes that shifted around them, fishermen who cast nets into calm rivers and pulled them back, filled with creatures unlike any catalogued dreams, of otherworldly cities hovering on the horizon, seen by entire villages yet never found again. Evelyn noted that technology behaved erratically near the anomalies. Compasses spun wildly, GPS devices failed to locate their position, radios picked up bursts of static interlaced with strange harmonies. Even human senses seemed unreliable. Distances felt compressed or expanded. Sometimes a simple walk between two trees could feel like a journey across continents. Other times, vast spaces shrank to nothing. In a few steps, Daniel developed specialized sensors to measure the distortions, finding that the anomalies pulsed with a rhythm almost like a heartbeat, waxing and waning with cycles that seemed tied to the movement of the auroras above. Jonathan composed experimental soundscapes based on the frequencies recorded within the zones, discovering that playing certain chords could temporarily stabilize or amplify the distortions. Samuel wrote of the growing sense among those who encountered the phenomena that they stood on the threshold of something immense, something sacred and terrifying. They were not merely witnesses, they were participants in an unfolding drama that stretched back beyond memory. The phenomena grew stronger over time. What began as small ripples became roiling waves, fields where day and night coexisted in patchy mosaics, forests where trees shed and regrew their leaves, in moments lakes where reflections showed not the current sky but ancient constellations, long forgotten. Evelyn led expeditions into deeper anomalies, taking meticulous notes, sketching the twisting paths of light, documenting the way sound bent and echoed. Daniel constructed portable resonance stabilizers devices designed to anchor their surroundings to baseline reality, allowing them to push further into zones where space folded in on itself. Jonathan experimented with musical interventions, layering harmonics to smooth the jagged edges of broken space-time. Samuel chronicled every journey, every discovery, every wonder, and every terror they found. Abandoned villages swallowed by mist where time seemed to loop, endlessly collapsing and restarting, broken structures, standing half in and half out of phase, with the world lakes whose surfaces froze and melted, in rhythmic pulses synchronizing with unseen tides. Children born near the anomalies who displayed uncanny abilities, enhanced perception, rapid learning, vivid dreams of distant stars. Evelyn proposed that the anomalies were not accidents, but emergent properties of the Earth's reconnection to the cosmic network, that they were the birth pains of a new reality struggling to be born. Daniel warned that while the anomalies held incredible potential, they also posed grave dangers if left unchecked. They could fracture the world beyond repair. Jonathan dreamed of a future where humanity learned to navigate these altered spaces, weaving them into art, architecture, and culture. Samuel told stories of ancient gateways forgotten and sealed, until now whispering that the Earth was remembering not just who it was, but where it belonged, and through it, humanity had a chance to remember too. They began to understand that the anomalies were early signs of something greater, that the bending of light, the twisting of time, the emergence of shadowy figures were all heralds of a larger transformation. Evelyn often stood at the edge of a distortion, watching the world ripple and shift, feeling the deep pull of possibilities. Daniel measured the shifting currents, tracing patterns that hinted at deeper structures underlying reality. Jonathan played his music into the mist, listening for the echoes that hinted at unseen listeners. Samuel spun tales by flickering fires, weaving memory and prophecy into a single tapestry, and always the anomalies grew stronger, clearer, more demanding. The world was not breaking, it was opening, calling, singing, waiting, and humanity stood at the threshold of the unknown, hearts trembling with fear and wonder. Ready or not, the gates were forming, and the journey beyond had already begun. As Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed ventured deeper into the zones where the most intense resonance occurred, they began to notice subtle but undeniable distortions in the fabric of reality. The air shimmered with an almost imperceptible hum. The ground beneath their feet felt strangely elastic at times, and the horizon wavered like a mirage. But it was Daniel who first identified the true nature of these anomalies. His instruments began to pick up on irregularities in the electromagnetic spectrum, subtle fluctuations that were not accounted for by any known natural phenomena. At first, he thought it might be a temporary interference, but as the weeks passed, the phenomenon only intensified. The distortions were not just visual or sensory. They were foundational, shaking the very structure of space-time itself. Daniel postulated that what they were encountering was a fracture in the space-time continuum, not large or violent enough to tear reality apart, but enough to cause a ripple effect that distorted the local fabric of existence in ways no one had expected for Daniel. This was not just a scientific curiosity, it was a pivotal discovery, because if space-time itself could be distorted so subtly and pervasively, it suggested something far more profound than random glitches in the atmosphere. These fractures were the manifestation of a much larger process. He began to describe the disturbances as oscillations, small waves that propagated through the very core of existence, like the ripples caused when a stone is thrown into a pond, except the pond was not water but the very medium that held the universe together. The more Daniel observed the phenomenon, the more convinced he became that these were not accidental occurrences, but rather the result of the ongoing resonance with the cosmic network. Something was triggering these fractures, something vast and purposeful. He hypothesized that the disturbances were localized tears in the space-time continuum, where the normal flow of time and space was no longer fixed, but became fluid and malleable. At these points, time itself oscillated in ways that could not be explained by traditional physics. Moments would stretch and compress without warning. Objects would appear to move faster or slower, depending on their proximity to the fracture. In space-time, Daniel recorded instances where travelers who entered these areas experienced time dilation or temporal loops, where seconds felt like hours and sometimes entire days would disappear in an instant. The more they studied the phenomenon, the clearer it became that the structure of reality was destabilizing. Within these zones, they were dealing with pockets of altered space-time that were becoming more and more unpredictable. In some regions, light itself bent at impossible angles, casting shadows where there should have been none. Evelyn recalled a time when she had walked along a path through the forest, only to return moments later to find the trees around her had shifted positions, as though the landscape itself had been rearranged in an instant. She had tried to explain it as exhaustion or a trick of perception, but deep inside she knew the fabric of reality was unraveling in these zones. In the most disconcerting ways, Daniel theorized that the cause of these fluctuations was linked to the cosmic resonance now flooding Earth. He suggested that the vibrations from the awakened network were resonating through the planet at a frequency that was misaligned with the natural laws of space and time. The more intense the resonance, the more severe the distortions became. He also believed that the distortions were not evenly distributed across the planet. Some areas were more affected than others, depending on the local alignment of energy flows and the density of the resonance in those areas. Evelyn worked with Daniel to map the regions most affected by the space-time shifts. They found that these fractures seemed to concentrate at the intersection points of the strongest resonance lines. It was as if the convergence of these powerful energies was warping reality itself. Jonathan had felt the effects of these disturbances on his own body. His perception of time was becoming increasingly erratic, and when he played his music, the notes would sometimes linger in the air for longer than usual or disappear entirely, only to return moments later in a different key. Samuel described how the landscape itself seemed to be in a state of flux during one of their excursions. He had observed trees growing in strange formations, almost as if they were being pulled into alignment with some unseen force. Other times, the ground would crack and shift beneath their feet in a manner that seemed entirely unnatural. The team realized that this phenomenon was not something they could simply measure or document. It was something they would have to live with, something they would have to experience directly as the fractures in space-time continued to grow more pronounced. They began to encounter areas where time did not flow evenly. In some places, hours seemed to pass in minutes, while in others, moments stretched into what felt like days. Daniel explained that these irregularities were likely the result of temporal dilation, where certain regions were experiencing time at different rates. He likened it to the theory of relativity, but on a much more localized scale, where the differences in gravitational fields and speed could stretch or compress the passage of time. The more they ventured into these zones, the more they realized how deeply the fabric of reality was being influenced. The phenomena were not just cosmic oddities, they were signs of something much larger, unfolding, something that challenged everything they knew about space and time. Daniel began to conduct more experiments to test the limits of the distortions. He placed small objects at various points near the fractures and found that they moved unpredictably. Some objects remained still while others seemed to accelerate or decelerate seemingly of their own accord. In some instances, the objects disappeared entirely for a brief moment before reappearing in a different location entirely. Evelyn was the first to encounter a portal-like fracture, a rift, in the space-time fabric where the very air seemed to shimmer and pulse with a strange light. It was as though a doorway had been opened to another world, one that existed in parallel to their own, but she could not discern whether it was a momentary glitch in reality or a true tear between dimensions. It was clear that the phenomenon was not random, nor was it entirely controlled. It was as though the very foundation of reality was being shaped and molded by an unseen force, a force that had awakened. From the depths of space, Daniel believed that the resonance was not just a signal. It was a call. It was awakening the Earth to its larger role in the cosmic web, and in doing so, it was pulling on the very threads that held the universe together. They had witnessed the opening of these fractures before, but never in such intensity. Never with such clarity. Samuel theorized that the fractures were acting as gateways or portals leading to alternate timelines or alternate dimensions. They were not just bending space, they were bending time itself, opening possibilities for what could be and what had already been. Daniel's theory was that this was part of a greater cosmic alignment, something that had been set into motion long before humanity had ever come into existence. And now that it was underway, the distortions were drawing the Earth into a new phase of existence. The rift was not just a tear in space, but an invitation to remember what had been forgotten. The boundaries between worlds were thinning, and humanity stood at the precipice, unsure of which path to follow. Would they fall into the fractures and embrace the unknown, or resist and risk falling into oblivion? One thing was certain: the time of reckoning was fast approaching, and the answer would lie in how humanity responded to the resonating call of the universe. As the days passed and the strange phenomena continued to unfold around them, Jonathan Pryce and Samuel Reed found themselves drawn to an entirely new aspect of the disturbances that were growing stronger with each passing day. It was not just the changes in space-time or the shifting landscape that intrigued them, but the sound, the melodies that seemed to emerge from the very fabric of reality itself. At first, Jonathan thought it was a trick of his mind or a side effect of the growing resonance. He had already experienced strange shifts in his perception of sound in the areas of greatest distortion, but as the days went on, he realized that these melodies were not a figment of his imagination. They were real, and they came from everywhere, from the air, the trees, the ground, from the very sky itself. It was as though the universe was singing to him, songs that were old beyond comprehension and new beyond anything he could have ever conceived. They were melodies that couldn't be played on any instrument he had ever known, and at times they felt so powerful that they seemed to vibrate, not just in his ears, but in the very core of his being. Jonathan began to write down the music in a feverish rush, notes that seemed to flow through him as if they had always existed somewhere deep inside him, just waiting to be brought to life. And when he played them, even in the dead of night, The melodies would echo in the wind stirring the trees and the earth around him. Daniel had noticed the same phenomenon, but in a different way. His instruments would often pick up on these sounds when Jonathan played, and the data seemed to correlate with the energy flows and the shifting magnetic fields that were now so prevalent in the resonant zones. But it wasn't just Jonathan who was hearing these melodies. Samuel had been spending his days speaking with the people living near the areas of highest resonance, and they had begun to describe strange experiences of their own, as if they too were hearing things that were not of this world. Stories began to emerge from the people living in the midst of these disturbances. They spoke of ancient cities that had appeared in the mist only to disappear moments later, of vast structures built from stone and energy that hummed with an otherworldly resonance. Samuel gathered the stories of travelers and villagers alike and wrote them down, as if the act of writing was the only way to hold on to something that was slipping through their fingers. And what Samuel recorded was nothing short of astonishing. Some spoke of cities where the streets were laid with jewels that shimmered like stars in the night sky. Others described towering spires that stretched into the heavens like the fingers of giants reaching for the stars. All of them spoke of an undeniable sense of belonging, as if these places had always been a part of their lives, but they could never quite remember how they had known them. But what struck Samuel most was the common thread woven through all the accounts of the cities and their strange appearance. The people all spoke of a call that came from the cities, a wordless call that resonated deep within their chests. It was not a sound that could be easily described, but it was something they all understood instinctively, something that called them home. They described it as a pull toward something vast and ancient, something that was not human, but that recognized them in ways that made them feel as though they had always been part of it all along. Jonathan had experienced this feeling in his own way. The music he had composed had begun to feel like a response to something larger than his own thoughts or creativity. It was as though he were channeling the sounds of the earth itself, the distant echoes of long-forgotten civilizations resonating through his fingers. But he was not just hearing the music. He was part of it, part of the symphony of the universe that stretched far beyond his understanding, and he knew that these sounds were not random or isolated. They were connected to something much greater than himself, something that was calling him and all of humanity back into the fold of the cosmic network. These cities, these ancient places, were not relics of the past, but portals into a greater understanding, into a deeper connection with the universe. Samuel's story spoke of this connection, of the sensation that these ancient cities were gateways to something larger, that they were perhaps the remains of a civilization that had once thrived across the stars, a civilization that had somehow become lost or forgotten, but whose memory was now waking up and pulling at the hearts of those still living on Earth. He noted that these calls were not simply invitations, but urgency, a pull that could not be ignored. The stories, the melodies, the music, they were all part of the same symphony, a signal that had been broadcast across the universe and was now returning to those who were ready to listen. It was not a single melody or a single sound, but a chorus of voices, each one resonating in perfect harmony with the others, and the earth itself was listening. Every forest, every river, every mountain, every living thing seemed to vibrate with the hum of this cosmic signal. Jonathan played his music into the night, and the sounds seemed to respond like a conversation between him and the cosmos. The melodies deepened and shifted like the breath of the earth itself. At times they became so complex that he could hardly follow them, but in those moments he felt a profound sense of connection, as if the music was not just something he was creating, but something that was being created through him, a dialogue between him and the universe that had been waiting for him to answer. Samuel's stories began to take on a new urgency as the people who had once been afraid of these experiences began to understand their true nature. They were not crazy. They were not imagining things. They were awakening to something larger, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them, and it was not just a matter of receiving knowledge, but of becoming a part of it, becoming part of the greater cosmic memory that spanned not just across space, but through time as well. The call was not just a memory, it was a reunion with the lost parts of themselves, a reunion with the civilizations that had come before and the stars that still shone above them. And so, as the days stretched into weeks and the resonance of the earth continued to grow stronger, the calls grew louder. The cities appeared more frequently, the melodies shifted and deepened, and the world stood on the precipice of a new awakening. Humanity was being asked to remember its place in the cosmos, to answer the call that had been waiting for them all along. As the resonance anomalies continued to deepen around the world, and the distortion of space-time became increasingly apparent, Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Pryce, and Samuel Reed found themselves standing at the precipice of a realization, one that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the phenomena they had been studying for months. After the initial discovery of the space-time fractures, the team had worked tirelessly to catalog the distortions, mapping their patterns and trying to understand their deeper implications. But the more they explored, the more they began to realize that these distortions were not mere disruptions. They were something more profound, something far more significant than they had initially believed. At first, Daniel had referred to them as fractures in the fabric of space-time. His instruments had detected unexplained deviations in the natural laws of physics, and while these deviations were seemingly random, they shared certain characteristics that suggested an underlying pattern. With each day that passed, the team began to see that the fractures weren't just tears in reality, but were instead openings, gateways into something beyond the constraints of the physical world, something connected to memories and alternate realities. Samuel had spent much of his time speaking with the local communities and studying the stories of people who had encountered these strange zones. His notes had become filled with descriptions of people who spoke of visions and dreams not tied to their own experiences, but to forgotten histories and otherworldly landscapes. They told tales of walking into places where time moved differently, where the world appeared to stretch and bend in ways that felt unnatural but also familiar. There were even reports of people encountering shadowy figures who seemed to emanate a sense of ancient wisdom, but vanished when approached. These figures were unlike anything the local people had ever seen before, yet they all shared a common trait: they did not belong to this world. Samuel's research had led him to a startling conclusion. These stories were not simply the result of imagination or cultural myth. They were consistent with the very anomalies the team was observing. These disturbances were gateways of a sort, portals between the present and other realities. Daniel theorized that these distortions were not random, but part of a larger cosmic process, a network that had been activated by the growing resonance on Earth, a cosmic web that had long been dormant and was now coming to life with the planet as its focal point. These gateways were not complete, not fully stable, but semi-stable at best. They were openings that allowed glimpses into other layers of reality, other timelines, and even other worlds. Samuel agreed with this hypothesis, but took it further. He believed that the gates were not just physical openings in space-time, but were directly linked to the biological network of the cosmos. As the resonance deepened and as the Earth itself responded to this awakening, the gateways became more pronounced, more interactive, reaching across dimensions and timelines, connecting them through a form of cosmic memory. This cosmic memory was not just a collection of facts and history, but a living entity that had been preserved across the cosmos, waiting to be reawakened through the Earth and humanity. It was not merely the memory of one world or one species. It was the memory of all life forms across all worlds. Samuel theorized that these gates were not designed to remain open for long periods of time. They were unstable portals that fluctuated in their connection to the cosmic network. Some were temporarily opened by the resonance only to close again when the resonance shifted. Others were active only in certain places at certain times, and even these were prone to closing without warning, leaving only vague impressions of the reality beyond. Daniel worked to track the fluctuations of these portals using advanced sensors and quantum mechanics. He found that each gate was connected to a specific point in the network of the Earth's resonance. He called these connections nodes, areas of heightened energy, where the resonance reached a critical mass, creating ripples in the fabric of space-time. These nodes acted as keys that unlocked the gateways and allowed brief glimpses into alternate realities. These glimpses were not merely visual, they were experienced on a deeper level as well. Jonathan had begun to notice a strange phenomenon in his music. When he played certain notes or combinations of notes near the gateways, the distortions would intensify. The harmonics of the earth itself seemed to respond, and the gates would briefly open wider. The music was not just an art form, it was a language that the earth and the cosmos used to communicate. And when Jonathan played it in harmony with the resonance, it unlocked deeper connections to the gateways. The team theorized that the resonance was creating a temporary synchronization between the timelines and dimensions that the gates opened to it. Was as though the Earth itself was learning to connect with these alternate realities and accessing their knowledge and memories, but they knew that this synchronization was fragile. The semi-stable nature of the gates meant that they were prone to collapse at any time. They could provide access to vast knowledge, but only if the conditions were right and only for a short time. At first, the team struggled with the implications of these discoveries. They were not dealing with simple anomalies or cosmic accidents. They were dealing with gateways that were connecting Earth to a vast network of cosmic memory, a network that had been dormant for eons, waiting to be accessed when the time was right. But as they explored the gates further, they realized the stakes were much higher than they had anticipated. These were not just windows into other worlds. They were doors that led to alternate timelines and potential futures. They could not afford to allow the gates to collapse or be closed off. Prematurely, the team began to experiment with ways to stabilize the gates, to make them fully operational without collapsing the space-time. Around them, Daniel and Jonathan worked together to modify the resonance stabilizers they had developed, hoping to anchor the gates to a more stable point in the cosmic network, while Samuel documented their progress and kept track of the growing number of reports from the local communities of further disturbances and visions that seemed to coincide with the gates becoming more active. Their work was slow and methodical, but each success felt like a breakthrough. As they began to stabilize the gateways, they learned more about the deeper workings of the cosmic network. The gates were not just random occurrences, they were part of a delicate balance that linked Earth to the rest of the universe. A balance that was now being disrupted by the awakening resonance. Evelyn realized that humanity stood at the heart of this awakening, standing between the known world and the unknown world, between the present and the possible futures. The gates were not merely there to be observed, they were a call to action, a chance for humanity to step forward and claim its place within the larger cosmic tapestry. The team knew that they had to find a way to make these semi-stable gates stable and permanent. They were the key to humanity's future and the future of the entire cosmos. But they also knew that with the growing instability of the gates, the answer would not come easily, and the choice would be humanity's alone. As the research team delved deeper into the mysteries of the spatial distortions and the semi-stable gates that had begun to open across the Earth, Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Pryce, and Samuel Reed found themselves confronted not only with the unknown, but also with a deeper understanding of what these gateways represented. What they had initially perceived as simple anomalies or distortions in space-time were becoming something much more profound and dangerous. The gateways they discovered were not uniform. They were not all the same kind of passage. They were divided into two distinct types, and each type presented its own challenges and potential for humanity to either embrace or destroy itself. The first type of gateway was one that led to what could only be described as flourishing life. Entire ecosystems untouched by the chaos of Earth were visible through these gates. Lush green forests stretching across vast landscapes, oceans teeming with vibrant marine life, and skies that shimmered with the purest light. These were places where life had evolved along a different path, or perhaps was in the process of evolving untouched by the pollution and destruction that had marred Earth for centuries. It was as though these gateways led to realms where the balance of life had been maintained, where species had flourished and evolved in harmony with their environment. Jonathan had felt it most intensely when he first encountered one of these gateways while playing music beneath the auroras. The sound had resonated deeply within the gate, and a wave of emotion had washed over him. It was a sense of peace and wholeness, a connection to a kind of life that felt foreign yet familiar. It was as though the Earth itself was yearning for this connection, for the world to return to a state of balance and peace that it had once known. Evelyn had explored these gates with the help of specialized tools designed to measure the fluctuations in space-time and electromagnetic fields. She found that the gates leading to these flourishing worlds were more stable, more coherent. The energy flow was harmonious, like a song in perfect pitch. These gates led to places where life had evolved over eons without the disruptions of human interference, places where evolution had taken a natural course. Samuel believed that these gateways were offering humanity a chance to witness what could have been if the Earth had been allowed to flourish without the ravages of exploitation and environmental destruction. These gates were not just opportunities to observe another world, but a chance to remember the natural state of being, one where life evolved with respect for the rhythms of nature and the balance of ecosystems. They were a reminder of the potential humanity still had to return to a state of harmony with nature. But these gateways were not without their dangers. As the team explored deeper into the network, they discovered a second type of gate, one that was far more treacherous and far less inviting. These gates led to worlds on the brink of collapse, places where life had failed to maintain its balance, where chaos and division had torn apart ecosystems. Entire civilizations had fallen into ruin, leaving behind only fragments of their once grand existence. These gates opened into realms that had long been abandoned and forgotten, or perhaps they were on the verge of being forgotten in the chaos that had enveloped them. These worlds were decayed and broken, and the team could feel the emptiness that radiated from them. The landscapes were barren, the skies filled with storm clouds and lightning that crackled violently across the sky. The oceans were poisoned and the forests were withered and dead. Where once life had thrived, now only remnants remained. The creatures that still inhabited these worlds were twisted and unnatural, distorted by years of neglect and exploitation. The very air in these places felt thick with despair and stagnation. When Jonathan first encountered one of these gates, he felt it immediately, a sense of dread that washed over him like a cold wave. It was a place where nothing grew and nothing lived in peace. The air itself felt hostile, like a force that was actively trying to keep them from entering. Samuel had found it even harder to reconcile the existence of these worlds with the possibilities offered by the flourishing gates. He began to wonder what caused these worlds to fall apart, what had led them to such destruction and despair. Had it been the same forces that were now at work on Earth, or had it been something else entirely? Was it a warning to humanity about what could happen if the Earth continued on its current path? Or was it simply a reflection of the natural cycles of life and death that existed across the universe? The team's investigation into these gates led them to a chilling realization. Both types of gates, the ones that led to flourishing worlds and the ones that opened into decayed realms, were connected. The gates themselves were part of a larger cosmic cycle, one that was tied to the fate of the universe and the cycles of life and death that governed it. The flourishing gates were not just worlds of peace and beauty. They were worlds that had managed to preserve their balance and vitality in the face of tremendous challenges. They were the result of a cosmic harmony that allowed life to evolve in its purest form. These worlds had avoided the pitfalls that other civilizations had fallen into, but the decayed gates were the opposite. They were worlds that had lost their balance. They had succumbed to the forces of chaos and destruction that permeated the universe, and now they stood as cautionary tales of what could happen if the balance was disturbed too far. It became clear that the team was not merely witnessing a random collection of events. They were observing two opposing forces that were inextricably linked, the forces of creation and destruction that were shaping the universe itself, and it was up to humanity to decide which force they would embrace. The more they explored the gates, the more they understood that they were on the verge of something larger, a moment when the future of humanity and the future of the Earth would be shaped by which force they chose to follow. Would they choose the path of flourishing life and evolution, or would they allow themselves to fall into the chaos and destruction that had plagued so many other worlds? The choice was not just about survival, it was about the very nature of existence and what humanity's place in the cosmos would be. As the gates continued to pulse with energy, the team knew they were running out of time. They had to make a decision. They had to choose which path humanity would follow and whether they could save the Earth from falling into the same fate as the decayed worlds they had seen, or if they would be able to help guide the Earth back into a state of balance where life could thrive once again. As the resonance deepened and the gateways continued to pulse with unpredictable energy, Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed began to feel a growing sense of urgency about the increasingly volatile nature of the phenomenon they had uncovered. The more they explored the nature of the gateways, the more it became clear that they were not just passive openings into alternate realities, but were in fact powerful portals that could be influenced by the forces at play on Earth and within the cosmos. These gates were not simply neutral passages between worlds. They were fragile and dangerous conduits that could easily be destabilized if the balance between the two opposing forces was tipped too far in one direction. The team had already observed the two distinct types of gates: the flourishing worlds where life thrived and evolved, and the decayed worlds ravaged by chaos and destruction. But they had also begun to notice that the boundaries between these two types were not always clear. Sometimes the gates that led to flourishing realms would begin to show signs of deterioration and instability, while those leading to decayed worlds would momentarily glow with a strange energy that seemed to pulse in time with the heartbeat of the planet. This fluctuation between the two types of gates was a warning, one that they had not fully understood until now. Evelyn was the first to recognize the true nature of the threat that loomed ahead. She had been studying the flow of energy through the gates and had come to a chilling realization. The gates were more than just doorways. They were being shaped by the resonance of Earth itself and the balance of forces that had been awakened by the cosmic energy flooding the planet. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that the gates were a reflection of the state of the Earth's consciousness and the state of humanity's awareness. If humanity embraced the call of the resonance and moved toward unity, harmony, and evolution, the gates would remain stable and open, leading to greater possibilities and understanding. But if humanity chose the path of division, chaos, and destruction, if they allowed fear, greed, and the darker impulses of human nature to dominate, the gates would begin to shift. The energy within them would grow erratic and uncontrollable, and the results could be catastrophic. Daniel had witnessed the fluctuations in the energy around the gates firsthand. As he tracked the resonant signals, he had seen how certain areas would become unstable as the forces of chaos began to influence the resonance. The gates that had once been stable would tremble and pulse erratically as if they were trying to close on themselves or collapse into chaos. The portals would open and close at random times, flickering like broken windows into other worlds. The fabric of reality itself seemed to be pulling apart as the conflicting energies of creation and destruction warred within the gates. Samuel had been observing the effects of these fluctuations on the people living near the gates and had begun to notice disturbing patterns of behavior in those who were exposed to the strongest distortions. People who had once been calm and rational began to exhibit signs of irrational fear, paranoia, and aggression, as if the chaos within the gates was infecting their minds and warping their perceptions. It was not just the physical distortions that were affecting them, it was the psychological toll of the growing instability in the fabric of reality itself. Jonathan had felt the effects of this psychological distortion in his music. The melodies he had composed with such clarity and ease began to lose their coherence. When he played near certain gates, the notes would waver and fracture as if they were being pulled out of tune by some invisible force. It was as though the gates themselves were pulling on his thoughts, distorting his emotions and his sense of purpose. It was becoming harder and harder to distinguish between the influence of the gates and the inner turmoil he was experiencing. This growing instability was not just a natural byproduct of the gates. It was a warning. The energy within the gates was growing more volatile with each passing day, and the more the forces of chaos were allowed to take hold, the more likely it was that the gates would shift into something far darker, something that would not just tear at the fabric of reality, but would rip open new worlds of destruction and despair. Samuel had begun to see the writing on the wall. He had seen the effects of the gates on the world around him, how the instability in one area would cause ripple effects in neighboring regions, creating a domino effect of chaos that spread outward from the points of greatest disturbance. He had heard stories of entire towns that had been swallowed by the void where the gates had been active, and the people living there had disappeared without a trace. It was as though the gates were opening up to consume everything in their path, and no one was safe if the forces of chaos were allowed to continue unchecked. The very fabric of existence could unravel, and what would be left behind would be a world that was unrecognizable and trapped in an eternal state of decay and turmoil. The team had no illusions about the danger they faced. If the gates continued to open and close in such an unstable manner, a destabilization of the space-time continuum could lead to the complete breakdown of the natural order. It was not just about the physical destruction of the Earth or the collapse of civilizations. It was about the very essence of existence itself being torn apart if the chaos was allowed to win. If humanity allowed itself to succumb to fear and division, the gates would no longer be gateways. They would become rifts, uncontrollable and destructive, tearing at the fabric of reality and pulling Earth into nightmare realms where the laws of time and space no longer applied, where death and destruction would reign unchecked. As the team debated their next steps, Evelyn felt the weight of the decision that lay before them. Humanity was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the choices they made in the coming days would determine the future of the Earth and all life on it. They could choose to align with the resonance and move toward unity, or they could choose to give in to chaos and risk the complete collapse of everything they had worked to protect. The gates were not just the key to the future. They were the battleground where the forces of creation and destruction would face off, and the outcome would shape the future of the universe itself. As the hours passed and the energy from the gates continued to pulse with growing intensity, the team knew they had little time left. The forces of chaos were closing in, and if they did not act quickly, the gates would shift permanently into destructive chaos and Earth would be lost forever. The research team had been tracking the fluctuations in the resonance for weeks, but no one could have predicted the event that was about to unfold. It had been a strange and unsettling journey, with the increasing instability of the gates and the growing sense of dread that had begun to weigh heavily on the group. The gates, once thought to be mere anomalies, had begun to reveal something far more profound and dangerous. They were doorways to something far beyond the physical world, and in one instant they would open up to reveal a part of the universe that had been hidden from humanity for eons. That night, as the aurora borealis painted the sky with its intense shifting colors, the team gathered around their equipment, sensing that something was different. The air was thick with energy, almost electric, and the ground beneath their feet felt charged with an unspoken tension. Jonathan had been playing his music, trying to harmonize with the growing resonance that had been reverberating through the atmosphere, when suddenly the air around them seemed to ripple. It was subtle at first, a faint distortion in the atmosphere, but it grew more pronounced with each passing second. The ground vibrated gently, and the colors of the aurora intensified, swirling in a pattern they had never seen before. Evelyn, sensing the shift, motioned for the team to gather closer, her heart racing as she watched the phenomenon unfold. The gate was opening, not as it had before, with flashes of light and brief glimpses of other worlds, but fully, completely, in a way that shook the very foundation of reality itself. The sky above them began to shimmer, and the air grew heavy, with a presence that seemed both familiar and alien. For a moment, everything stopped, the world holding its breath as the gate came into full view. It was not a mere tear in space-time, but an immense doorway, a portal that stretched up into the sky, glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Through it, they could see flashes of distant landscapes, otherworldly cities and skies filled with strange, swirling constellations. But what caught their attention most were the memories that began to emerge from the gate. It was as though the gate was not just a passage, but a repository of ancient knowledge, unlocking visions from forgotten civilizations. The images that flooded their minds were not of the past as they understood it, but of something much older, stretching back to the very origins of the universe itself. There were cities that rose and fell in the span of moments, civilizations that had harnessed the power of the stars and beings who had existed far beyond the limitations of mortal understanding. These were not just visions, but memories imprinted on the very fabric of space-time, memories that had been locked away for eons, waiting to be rediscovered. As Jonathan continued to play, the music seemed to resonate with the gate, amplifying the visions and memories. The melodies he played became deeper, richer, filled with an ancient harmony that was not of this world. It was as if the music itself was unlocking doors within the gate, allowing more of these ancient memories to pour through. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard before, a fusion of melodies, rhythms, and harmonies that transcended earthly music. It was as if the very universe itself was singing back to them a song older than time, a song that contained the essence of all that had come before. The team watched in awe as the memories took shape, revealing scenes from ancient worlds and distant stars. There were landscapes of unimaginable beauty, lush forests with towering trees that glowed with a soft inner light, oceans that shimmered with iridescent life, and skies that were alive with the movement of unseen forces. These were places where life had flourished in harmony with the cosmos worlds, where evolution had taken its course, unimpeded by the chaos that had gripped Earth. But within these memories there were also darker images, flashes of destruction of civilizations falling into ruin, of stars dying and worlds being consumed by chaos. These were not just memories of beauty, but of loss of the cycles of creation and destruction that were a fundamental part of the universe. As the gate continued to open, the team felt the weight of these memories bearing down on them. It was as if they were witnessing the rise and fall of entire worlds, each echoing in the space around them, each memory intertwining with the others, creating a vast web of knowledge that stretched across time and space. Samuel, who had been recording everything, noted that the memories felt familiar, as if they were somehow tied to the collective consciousness of humanity. It was as though the gate was not just showing them other worlds, but also unlocking something deep within themselves, a connection to something greater. The melodies that Jonathan played seemed to be the key to accessing these memories, and as he continued to play, the music grew more complex, more intricate, as though it were evolving in real time, matching the rhythms of the gate itself. Evelyn could feel the immense power emanating from the gate, a force that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. She realized that this was no ordinary phenomenon. This was a direct link to the cosmic network, a network that connected all of existence, a web that stretched across time and space, and Earth was now a part of it. The gate was not just a doorway to other worlds, but a bridge between Earth and the greater universe, between the present and the ancient past. But with this realization came a new understanding of the danger they faced. The memories that were flooding through the gate were not just stories of the past, they were warnings. These civilizations that had once flourished, these worlds that had once been full of life, had fallen into ruin, and the team could not ignore the fact that they too were at a crossroads. If the resonance was allowed to tip too far toward chaos, if the gates continued to open uncontrollably, they could risk bringing the same destruction to Earth. The night seemed to stretch on forever as the gate opened wider, the memories and melodies flowing freely, and the team stood at the threshold of something immense, something they could not fully understand. But they knew one thing for certain: the moment of reckoning had arrived. Earth was on the brink of either becoming a part of the cosmic harmony or falling into the chaos and destruction that had swallowed so many worlds before. And the decision was theirs to make. The days had passed in a blur as the team delved deeper into the mysteries of the resonance and the unstable gates that had begun to form across the planet. Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed were no longer just witnesses to strange phenomena. They had become active participants in a grand cosmic event unfolding before their very eyes. They had come to understand that the gates were not mere anomalies in space and time. They were windows into countless realities, gateways to worlds that existed in parallel to their own, each one offering glimpses into different possible futures and pasts. What had once seemed like random fluctuations in the fabric of reality were now unmistakably connected to a larger process, a process that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. As the resonance continued to grow stronger, the gates themselves became more pronounced, more vivid, reflecting the strength of the forces that had been unleashed upon Earth. But it was the night the aurora once again illuminated the sky with its shimmering colors that the team would experience the most profound and unsettling event of all. The energy in the air was palpable. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with an intensity that seemed to pulse in time with the light above. It was as though the earth itself was alive, breathing deeply with each passing second. Evelyn felt at first a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the air around them as the resonance grew stronger and more chaotic. The lights in the sky were unlike anything they had seen before. The aurora was now rippling across the heavens with a brilliance that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the universe. Jonathan, who had been playing his music under the light of the aurora, suddenly stopped. He had felt it too. The change in the air, the way the energy seemed to hum and vibrate in tune with the gate that had been opening for so many months now. His music had always seemed to resonate with the gates, but tonight it felt as though the gates themselves were listening, not just to his music, but to the very pulse of the universe. And then it happened. The gate opened fully. It was no longer just a distortion in space or a brief flicker of light. It was a massive, shimmering portal stretching high into the sky. The light that poured from it was not just the faint glow they had seen before, but an intense, radiant brilliance that reflected an entire cosmos within its depths. As the gate stretched open, they could see countless worlds reflected within it, each one distinct yet connected through an unspoken thread. Some worlds were teeming with life, vibrant with lush landscapes and bustling ecosystems. Others were barren, desolate wastelands where nothing remained but the ruins of civilizations long past. Still others were filled with unimaginable beauty, crystal-clear oceans, towering mountain ranges, skies alive with the dance of auroras. Each world reflected in the gate seemed like a potential reality, one that existed just outside of reach, waiting to be explored or perhaps waiting to be claimed. As the team stood there staring in awe at the gate, they could not help but feel a sense of both wonder and fear. These worlds were not distant or unreachable. They were just on the other side of the veil of reality. They were waiting for humanity to make its choice to decide whether it would reach out and explore these worlds or retreat back into its own fractured existence. The gate shimmered and pulsed with energy, and Jonathan felt the familiar tug of the melodies that had come to him in the presence of the gates. This time, however, the melodies were different. They were not just echoes of distant worlds, but voices from those worlds calling to him, as if they recognized him as a part of their cosmic song. The music filled the air louder and louder, until it seemed to envelop them completely. Each note was a wave of energy flowing through them, reaching into the deepest parts of their beings. They were no longer just standing before the gate. They were part of it, part of the symphony that connected all life and all realities. Samuel stood beside Evelyn, his eyes wide with a mix of wonder and horror. He had been recording the data from the gate, but as he looked into it now, he could see more than just fluctuating energy signatures. He saw visions of the future of Earth, of humanity's potential to evolve and to join the cosmic network. But he also saw visions of destruction of a world consumed by chaos and division. The images in the gate were not just peaceful or harmonious. They were also dark and violent. Some realities reflected the worst aspects of human nature, where the gates had been corrupted and twisted by fear, greed, and conflict. It was as though the gate was offering them a choice. A path toward unity and peace, or a path toward destruction and chaos. The team felt the weight of the decision that lay before them. They were standing at the threshold of something vast and unknown, a doorway that could lead to unimaginable possibilities or unthinkable disaster. The gate was not just a portal to other worlds. It was a mirror reflecting the deepest truths about humanity and the choices it would make in the coming days. As they stared into the shimmering light of the gate, they could not help but wonder what lay beyond, what would await them if they stepped through. But in the midst of this cosmic revelation, there was one undeniable truth that was clear to them all. The Earth was waiting. Earth itself was silent, still, as though holding its breath. waiting for humanity to make its choice. The world stood at the edge of a precipice, with the weight of its future hanging in the balance. Would humanity reach out and embrace the possibilities offered by the gate, or would it retreat back into the chaos of its own making? As the gate shimmered and pulsed before them, they knew that the choice was not just theirs to make. It was a choice that would define the future of humanity and determine whether Earth would take its place in the cosmic symphony or be lost to the ravages of time and chaos. The image of the gate lingered in their minds as they stood there silent, waiting for the answer that they knew would come not from any force outside themselves, but from the very core of humanity's will to evolve and to become something greater than what it had ever been before.